My nightcap for this evening is an issue that is near and dear to my heart, something that personally I have experience with, and something that has always been one of the issues at the forefront of my mind and the forefront of my actions in terms of what I believe and what needs to be resolved. Tonight I wanted to talk about domestic violence. Domestic violence cases are on the rise. They've been on the rise during the pandemic, slightly before COVID, and as we've continued to usher into this quote unquote new normal. That brings up because a lot of victims are suffering from domestic violence, and I also have a personal stake in it. Growing up, it was something that I experienced in my household, and something that I vowed to make sure I was never a part of or witnessed again. I am very fortunate that one of the most important people to me in the world also happens to be one of the strongest, and also happens to be one of the bravest and most inspiring people. My mom was a victim of domestic violence, and thankfully made sure that she was no longer a victim, and made sure that my brother and I were no longer further exposed to it. This hits home for me, as it does for many people who do experience the horrors of domestic violence. And oftentimes I think when we talk about domestic violence, a notion in some people's minds is that it's a one-off event, or it's a slap here and there, or it's a shove or a push, when those who do experience it or those who read about it know that domestic violence often is much more traumatic, much more severe, and studies show that domestic violence cases often end in victims losing their lives. So I wanted to erase some of the stigma with what comes with domestic violence, and also illustrate that we should be checking on our friends. We should check on those who are closest to us, maybe our partners or friends, whatever the case is. And we can do that during this time. And there have been a lot of great social media sites, and I've been really encouraged to see a lot of sites deal with domestic violence in their own way. A lot of online retailers have been very creative in how they can help those who are suffering from domestic violence, victims who are being abused. Some online retailers have put items up for sale, and if you order those particular items, they know that you are in need of help, and they know that you are a victim of violence in the household. The reason that this is so scary, and the reason that this is actually such a massive deal, and cases are rising. This is not a hypothetical. In fact, the UN warned a number of agencies that domestic violence was going to increase, and we were going to see a surge. They warned a lot of governments that women's safety was at risk during the pandemic. See, when you can't leave your home to escape to a job or a friend's house or just anywhere else, you end up stuck in the household. And what do you do when you're stuck at home with the person that you fear the most, with the person who's actually abusing you? Now, I know that men also suffer from domestic violence, and that is also wrong. But let's be clear, let's be honest. We know that most of the cases involving domestic violence victims are too often women. So what do? We know that the National Domestic Violence Hotline in the States typically receives about 2,000 calls per day. France reported a surge in domestic violence cases that were reported. And in Spain, the emergency number for domestic violence, its usage rose 18% during the pandemic. It's happening globally. It's not just here in the United States. It's happening around the world. Other ways that people have become very creative with being able to help those victims is sign language. You may have seen the sign.
Can you share that banana bread recipe?
Sure. It's actually my mom's banana bread recipe, but it's pretty foolproof and super easy.
Well, I really appreciate it. I know your mom's a great baker, so it should be good.
And that is a sign that victims can use when they're on a Zoom call or web call of any sort to communicate that they are in fact in trouble, because when you're stuck at home, once again, you really can't exactly blurt out that you're in need of help. Congress has done their job, so to speak. They put aside $47 million in the original stimulus package to commit to domestic violence cases and help in that regard, which is not nearly enough. States like California, Texas, and Illinois have reported between a 12 and 20% increase in domestic violence cases reported. 47 million is not going to cut it. Too often we're able to find money for bailing out big companies, military, or for any number of things that may or may not need that money. This is something that I genuinely know and believe is an issue that we need to handle. And what happens when you have a global pandemic and problems affecting the world is sometimes people get swept under the rug, cases get swept under the rug, and victims get swept under the rug. That's not something we can afford to do now. Too often we feel that we are reactive, or we say we wish we could have done something. And I know that once we get out of this pandemic, and we will get out of it, we're going to hear horror stories about people who are trapped at home. So rather than listen to these horror stories and say, I wish I would have known, I wish you would have told me, or I wish I could have done something, let's be proactive. We know that they're happening now. We know that cases are being reported. We know the UN has warned about it. We know hotels have converted their rooms to shelters for women. And we know that cities and countries are reporting massive increases in calls for help. We are going to do what we can to show a number of ways in which you can call. We'll have the National Domestic Violence Hotline at the bottom of the screen, and we will do our part to do what we can to just help and show that there is something we can do for victims. I wanted to share this with you because it is something very near and dear to me. It's something that I think really should be getting a spotlight, and we can use our platform here to do that. Let's be proactive as much as we can versus reactive, because even one case is one case too many. For Late Night in Harlem, I'm Laurence Anthony, and this has been my Nightcap.